So now I've put the two shafts in the transmission. Forgive the color mix that I've got here. I hope it scares the mice away. That orange was as close as I thought I could get to what I had seen on the outside. I don't know if anybody's documented what was ever used for primer on these tractors, but there appeared to be some paint there. So back to the shaft and the bearings. Conventional wisdom is, unless you suspect bad workmanship on the previous assembly, to go with what you've got for shim pack. And that's what I've done with the new bearings on the top shaft. The service hint bulletin from April 1946 shows that the transmission input shaft spec for the bearing adjustment is 3 to 5 thousandths end play. And when assembled, this is easy to turn, but pushing both ways against the rollers, I'm not seeing anything much for movement on the dial indicator, and that's pretty much what it feels like, is that it's right at about at 0. So I happen to have 3 and a 5 thousandths shim here. I'm going to put one of them in there. The way it feels, it's got a little preload. I think maybe I might try the 5, which means I have to undo this quill again. There's about a 1/16 of an inch of shim pack in there. I didn't bother trying to mic that for thickness. It's quite a handful of shims, which seems to be possibly typical for this transmission drive shaft setup. Down to the differential drive shaft, again, if the cone point is correct, we would then be working with the front shim pack if we've got the right shims under the cup. And it's a trade-off which you need to do first. You need to have something set, so that's why I measured the cone point first with that setting to make sure that that shim pack was somewhere close. So now on the front shim pack, if we can see the diagram here, the bulletin from January 1944 shows that to set this up, we want a 10 thousandths preload. And if you remember that third gear idling on the shaft and the spacer or end washer that's on the shoulder there, the shim pack goes between the bearing race of this front differential drive shaft bearing, which is a slip fit, and that spacer. So when you tighten the nut, you're pulling in sort of an elastic way. You're pulling the differential drive shaft against this shim pack until it tightens up on the nut, and the spec on the nut is at the beginning, so it holds everything together. And you see here I have no gears on it at the present time. So when I put the existing shim in there, it was only one washer, about 25 thousandths thick. I didn't measure it, and put that in there just to see how it was with the shims under the rear end, hoping the cone point is as good as I believe it is. Then this shaft is again similar to the top shaft, has no end play. And when I can move it just easily with my thumb and fingers here, I think it's really close to like 0. It's not much effort at all. To read the specification here, this is to be adjusted so there's considerable drag on the shaft. And this is made by adjusting the front cone, and it says to adjust it until it spins freely with no end clearance, when the nut's been tightened sufficiently to clamp the bearing and the washer against the shoulder. Then take it apart and take out a 10 thousandth shim and put it back together again to get otherwise known as the rolling drag torque. If we were to put a scale on here and tie a string on there, if we had a specification for pulling the drag, this older transmission doesn't have the spec for that. So what I just read was to have it at 0 and then take out 10 thousandths. So I need to go shopping for some different shim packs. I don't believe they're available from John Deere anymore. A truck transmission repair dealership helped me out previously after I had tried to fabricate one. Well, I did using a Dremel, but that was a tedious job at best. So I'd rather not be making several of those. So I'll see if I can get some of those and tighten that, get that back together, and then we should be ready to load the gears and check the differential. So I hope to close off this transmission differential repair now with one last session, starting with some issues on the top shaft. And forgive me for using manual focus and camera movement here. The input shaft was scored and pitted in that area, so I've bought again a brand ready sleeve 99156. Expect most of you know how these work to come with a driver, and put that on there after I've put some liquid metal on the scored and pitted areas recommended. I've found a shim pack setting to give the 3 to 5 thousandths end play on the top shaft by installing that quill and prying it back out as I've described as needed. So going to the differential and differential drive shaft again, the preload on the differential drive shaft is important because you don't want either the differential or the differential drive shaft squirming around under load, so both of them are under preload. And the bulletin called for spins freely as the criteria, adds a zero end play, and I didn't find that easy to define, so I in fact used end play and adjusted that down to what I'm comfortable for the 10 thousandths preload on the drive shaft. At that point you can't, or I couldn't spin it with thumb and finger at the front, but reaching in and grabbing the shaft, you can rotate the shaft with the drag that puts on it. The differential then, my 10,000 shim removed took the backlash down to about nothing. So in this case, the 10 thousandths, well, and initially I had oil in there, so it was hard to tell what I was really starting with. So I took out a 5 thousandths shim on the backside and I also found that it was so tight going in that not only hammering it in with a dead blow hammer I think is normal, and then putting it in place with bolts, but I had to use a wrecking bar to pry it loose out of there, so I thought that was probably more than the 10 thousandths preload, which I wasn't going to do a lot of adjusting considering the difficulty in getting these bearings off. Now I will note that the new bearing did come off a lot more peacefully than the original bearing that had sat there for a while. But I took the bearing off, took out a 5,000 shim from the backside here to relieve some of the preload in the case for one thing, but I was curious what difference that would make for the backlash. And again, forgive the manual holding here and the focus issues, but now it's at 6 thousandths backlash, and the Prussian blue that's on the gears here is hard to see in the camera and the picture, but there are no bright hot spots. I think I have uniform wear across the tooth showing about halfway down, and it was interesting to look down at the drive pinion once the ink or the blue ink got on the drive shaft, showing fairly uniform coverage on the teeth down there too, and engagement. So in both sides of the differential gear, say it's hard to show anything with the camera, but I believe the tooth contact is quite uniform across the tooth, and uniform or into about halfway into the tooth or a little beyond. So I'm satisfied with this setup now, and ready to put it back in the tractor. The I have leakage at the final drive axles, so I'll be replacing those seals. That requires hammering the axle out. They're a light press fit into the sleeves, but that wasn't too difficult on the other tractor. So if I don't encounter anything interesting there, the next video could be with the tractor up and running and showing hopefully a quiet transmission.